Our penultimate presentation is by Dr. Ann Wheeler. Okay. ADHD symptoms in youth are differentially associated with polygenetic risk and neural substrates. Is there a if there is a history of traumatic brain injury?
Yes, sorry for the long title, but I'm going to tell you a little bit today about this study. We're interested in looking at symptoms in youth with and without a history of traumatic brain injury and the association between ADHD symptoms and genetic risk as well as brain structure. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is a major sequelae of traumatic brain injury in youth. So approximately 18% of youth with a traumatic brain injury will present with a new ADHD diagnosis post-injury. So the objective of this study was to examine whether genetic risk for ADHD, as well as altered subcortical volumes and white matter microstructure, were differentially associated with ADHD symptoms in youth with and without a history of mild traumatic brain injury. So what we're really interested in is how is developmental ADHD different than acquired ADHD? And we think that understanding more about the complex etiology of ADHD could have important implications for how these symptoms are treated. So to look at some of these questions, we turn to a sample of children and youth aged 8 to 21. As a large sample known as the Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort. They had extensive medical history taken and a psychiatric interview done. They all also provided genetic samples, and a subset of the participants had multimodal neuroimaging done as well. So for our purposes, we divided the participants into two groups. The first group had no history of traumatic brain injury, and then the second group had a history of mild traumatic brain injury. So to meet the criteria for our mild traumatic brain injury group, they had to have had at least one prior brain injury. It had to be associated with less than 30 minutes of unconsciousness, less than 24 hours of amnesia. There could be no skull fracture or neurosurgical interventions associated with the injury. And if you look at that first table there, you can see that about a quarter of them had experienced some loss of consciousness. Only 6% had post-traumatic amnesia, and about 1/5 reported post-traumatic headaches. And of the entire sample was just over 6,000 kids. 666 of them met criteria for this mild traumatic brain injury group. So this is just over 10%, which for me was quite striking as a large proportion of this community sample, although these numbers aren't as high as the ones we saw in the previous presentation. When we compare, if you look at the bottom table there, we compare the characteristics of the two groups. We can see that the TBI group is a little bit older. There's a higher proportion of males in that group, slightly higher IQ as well, and a higher proportion of Caucasians. So we control for all of these factors in our statistical analyses. So we've performed 4 separate analyses, looking at comparing symptoms between groups, as well as looking at the relationship between genetic risk and symptoms, and the relationships between brain structure and symptoms. And each of these were done in a different subsample of the larger sample, so I'm going to walk you through each of them one at a time. So from the entire sample had data for almost 9,000 participants, but we excluded those with missing data. We also excluded participants that didn't meet criteria for our group. So for example, if they had a more severe injury, they weren't included. We excluded youth that had any kind of moderate or severe medical condition. This ranges from autism to multiple sclerosis, epilepsy. So we ended up with about 6,000. Youth, and we asked the question, do ADHD symptoms differ between these two groups? And we saw that yes, the youth with a history of mild traumatic brain injury were reporting more ADHD symptoms than those with no history of traumatic brain injury. So then next, we wanted to know if genetic risk for ADHD differentially predicted symptoms in the two groups. So in order to estimate genetic risk, we turned to data from the Psychiatric Genetic Consortium's ADHD subgroup. And they recently pooled a large amount of data looking at 20,000 cases with ADHD compared to 35,000 controls. And comparing genome-wide variation, we could compute a polygenetic risk score that summarizes the amount of genetic risk for each individual. And reflecting the population in the Philadelphia area, the majority of participants in the sample were Caucasian, and then the second largest ethnic group was African Americans. And important for these genetic analyses is to perform them separately within different ethnic groups, and this is because there can be systematic variation in allele frequency between subpopulations of different ancestry, and this can confound results. So for today, I'm just going to present the primary analysis that was done in the Caucasian sample. We used a mixed model regression, and what we saw here was a significant interaction between TBI group status and genetic risk score on ADHD symptoms, and this indicates that the relationship between genetic risk and symptoms is different for the two TBI groups. And so what we see is a strong positive relationship between symptoms and genetic risk in the no history of TBI group. So that's the red line up there, and that's what we'd expect. If you have a higher genetic risk, you're going to report more symptoms. But we see a much weaker, a very weak relationship in the youth that had a history of mild traumatic brain injury. And we think that this suggests that there are other factors, other environmental factors likely to do with the injury itself that's affecting the brain structure and function, contributing to symptoms in these youth rather than the genetics. And so a subsample of 1,000 of these participants had multimodal neuroimaging done, and about 800 of them met our quality control criteria to look at subcortical image analysis. And so in this sample, we asked, does a volume of basal ganglia structures that are associated with ADHD differentially predict symptoms in our two TBI groups? So the basal ganglia consists of the striatum and the globus pallidus. They're richly interconnected components of anatomical loops that connect the thalamus to the cortex. And they're important components of cognitive processes that are disrupted in ADHD, including executive function, modulation of reward pathways, and inhibition of behavior. And many previous studies have shown that in children with ADHD, the volume of these structures is smaller than in children that don't have ADHD. So we could automatically segment these two regions on our T1 weighted magnetic resonance images using a pipeline known as the maggot brain pipeline. So you can see the sort of outline on the MRI there of the structures and the 3D reconstruction. So the striatum's the bigger structure, and the globus pallidus sits sort of right behind it. So this table summarizes the results from the subcortical imaging analysis. And so again, we used mixed model regression, and for these analyses, we account for multiple comparisons with the correction. And so you can see our regions of interest, the striatum and the globus pallidus listed up there. So what we did is we first asked if there was a significant interaction, which would tell us if the relationship between the volume of this structure and symptoms differed between our two TBI groups. And when we did see that significant interaction, we would go into each TBI group and look for the strength and the direction of this relationship. And when we didn't see a difference, we would look for a significant main effect that would indicate whether there's a relationship between the structure volume and symptoms in the group as a whole, so regardless of their sort of TBI status. So what we saw was there was not an significant interaction in the striatum, but there was a significant main effect. So there was a negative relationship between striatum volume and symptoms, and this is consistent with what other studies have shown. So a smaller volume of the striatum was associated with less symptoms. We did see a significant main effect in the globus pallidus. So this was driven by a negative effect in the TBI history group only. So we were sort of surprised that we didn't see an effect in the group that did not have a history of TBI. But it suggests that this structure might be sensitive to the injury effects and then associated with symptom presentation. For the white matter imaging analysis, we had about 750 subjects that met the quality control criteria. And we wanted to know if the microstructure of tracts that are associated with traumatic axonal injury are differentially associated with symptoms in the two groups. So to look at white matter microstructure, we use diffusion tensor imaging. We heard a little bit about this earlier. It's a diffusion-weighted MR method. It maps the diffusion of water molecules to give us information about white matter fiber structure. So the idea is the water molecules will move most easily along axonal bundles because there's the least number of obstacles to prevent diffusion in that direction. And so we can measure the diffusion along different axes and fit this to a 3D ellipsoid, and that's what this picture here is trying to show. And then from this information, we can do tractography analysis, which allows us to compute the probable trajectories of the fiber tracks and to visualize them. And then within these tracks, we can extract some mean values. We use two different metrics, fractional anisotropy and mean diffusivity, that are thought to reflect some of the microstructural properties of the white matter. So fractional anisotropy, or FA, reflects the magnitude and the directionality of the water diffusion. Increased FA is associated with increased diffusion along a single axis and is typically associated with increased structural integrity of the white matter. Mean diffusivity reflects the magnitude of the water diffusion, tends to move in the opposite direction of FA, so higher MD is associated with decreased structural integrity. And so by structural integrity is a little bit of a vague term that people use, but can reflect anything from the coherence of the fibers, the diameter of the fibers, myelination within the white matter, and it's really not clear exactly what the correlates of these metrics are. And so we know that the forces that act on a brain during the injury can cause diffuse axonal injury or traumatic axonal injury. And that this can be very heterogeneous and can be diffuse throughout the brain, but there is a typical pattern of axon injury that is seen based on neuropathological studies that shows that these two tracts tend to be preferentially affected. So the corpus callosum is the largest white matter tract in the brain. It connects the left and right hemispheres. It facilitates interhemispheric communication. And the corona radiata, it's the cortical connections of the brainstem, the basal ganglia, and the thalamus. Is the other region that we looked at. There's often traumatic axonal injury in the brainstem as well, but this tends to be in more severe cases, so we didn't look at that specifically here. But we focus on these structures also because in addition to their association with axonal injury, there's recent large meta-analyses of ADHD that have shown that they're associated with symptoms and diagnosis of ADHD. And then we divided these tracts into some subdivisions. So we divided the corpus callosum into 5 subdivisions and the corona radiata into 3 different subdivisions in the left and the right hemisphere. And we extracted mean values of FA and MD from each of these. So this table summarizes the results from the FA analysis. So you can see our 5 subdivisions of the corpus callosum and our 3 subdivisions of the corona radiata listed in the ROIs. And just as we did with the subcortical imaging analysis, we first looked for an interaction that would indicate a different relationship in our TBI groups. And then we also looked for main effects if we didn't see this interaction to see if there's any relationships between FA of tracts and symptoms overall. And there were 2 significant results. First, there was a significant interaction in the genu of the corpus callosum. So the genu is the most frontal anterior region of the corpus callosum. It connects the left and the right prefrontal cortex. And this was driven by a negative relationship in the group of youth with the history of mild traumatic brain injury. And there was a positive relationship between FA and the structure and symptoms in the youth that did not have a history of traumatic brain injury. So this effect was quite strong and it's very interesting to me. We think that it might indicate that there's different type of pathology that's contributing to symptoms in these 2 different groups. And we also saw a positive main effect in the posterior corona radiata on the left. And then finally, we looked at mean diffusivity within these same structures. And again, we saw 2 significant results. In the sensory fibers of the corpus callosum, we saw a positive main effect. And you can see that plotted down there on the left. And then there was a significant interaction in the left superior corona radiata. And this was driven by a positive relationship in the youth with the history of traumatic brain injury. So it suggests that these fibers may be sensitive to injury and contributing to symptoms as well. So just to sort of summarize what I told you, we did see that there was increased symptoms in our group of youth with a history of traumatic brain injury. And so one large caveat here is that we don't actually know if these symptoms manifested before or after the injury. And there's some evidence to indicate that children that have ADHD would be more likely to sustain an injury. So it's likely a combination of both of these things, and it's a bit muddied as a retrospective study. We saw that there was less of a relationship between genetic risk and ADHD in the youth with a history of traumatic brain injury, and think that maybe the injury itself is contributing, and what it's doing to the brain is contributing more to the manifestation of symptoms in these youth. In the subcortical imaging, we did see a differential relationship in the globus pallidus, driven by this negative relationship in the TBI group only. Although in the striatum, there was no difference in the two groups in terms of the negative relationship between the volume of the structure and symptoms. And then as far as the white matter imaging analysis goes, the answer wasn't straightforward on whether there's a differential relationships going on. It really depends on the tract that we look at, the subdivision, as well as the metric that we examined. So it's definitely not straightforward, but I think that just to highlight the result in the genu of the corpus callosum was particularly interesting in terms of seeing a different direction of the relationship. So overall, in these youth, having a history of a mild traumatic brain injury was quite common in this community sample, and it had differential associations between genetic risk and ADHD symptoms, as well as common and differential neural substrates. And we think that identifying the etiology of ADHD and how it differs when it's associated with an injury will have important implications for how these symptoms are treated, sort of getting at what Dr. Iverson was talking about in terms of personalized medicine and really dissecting heterogeneity within disorders and understanding their biological basis in order to be able to target treatments. And I'd just like to acknowledge my student, Sonia Stoyanovsky? No, I'm sorry. She did all of the analysis for this, a very bright student, and all of our collaborators at Sick Kids, CAMH, and the Douglas Hospital helped us access and process much of this data. And thank you for your attention. We have time for a question? Or?
Actually, I'm going to ask a question.
Sure.
How do you interpret the fact that the globus pallidus, which is kind of the least cognitive of these basal ganglia structures, is the only one that comes out differently between the groups, as opposed to the caudate and the
Yeah, we were sort of surprised because previous work had shown an association between symptoms, sorry. So she was asking why the globus pallidus we would see this differential effect, right?
versus the other globus, the caudate and the putamen.
So total speculation, but so previous research has shown both those structures to be important for ADHD, and so I would interpret the sort of striatum results as being more developmental in origin, seeing as they're similar between the two groups, but the globus pallidus potentially more vulnerable to injury because of the amount of white matter in the structure, and potentially that being the reason that we only see that association in the injury group.